Our journey into the long, layered history of Spain begins not with a flourish, but with the quiet, almost imperceptible fading of an empire. As the Visigothic kingdom emerged from the twilight of Roman rule in the 5th century CE. Imagine the Iberian Peninsula, a land already ancient, its sun-drenched plains and rugged mountains having witnessed centuries of Roman legions, Latin laws, and a veneer of classical culture. But by the early 400s, the grand edifice of Rome was crumbling, its distant emperors increasingly unable to hold the vast territories together. The legions, once the iron backbone of the empire, were stretched thin, battling threats on every frontier. Into this vacuum, like a slow-moving tide, came the Visigoths. They were not invaders in the traditional sense, not at first. They were a Germanic people, Arian Christians by faith, who had been granted lands within the Roman Empire as federati, allies tasked with defending the borders. But as Roman authority waned, their influence waxed. By 418 CE, following the sack of Rome itself in 410, the Visigoths had established a kingdom in southwestern Gaul, with Toulouse as its heart. Their presence in Iberia was initially more about pursuing other Germanic tribes, like the Vandals and Suebi, who had crossed the Rhine in 406 and subsequently ravaged the peninsula. Yet with each campaign, each battle fought on Roman soil, the Visigothic footprint grew deeper. The pivotal moment, perhaps, arrived in 507 CE with the Battle of Vouille, a devastating defeat for the Visigoths at the hands of the Franks under Clovis I. This battle effectively expelled the Visigoths from most of Gaul, forcing them to consolidate their power almost entirely within the Iberian Peninsula. Toledo, a city nestled in the heart of the Meseta, would eventually become their capital, a strategic stronghold that overlooked the Tagus River. From this new centre, the Visigothic kings began the long, often tumultuous process of forging the unified kingdom out of a fragmented land. The early Visigothic period in Iberia was characterized by a fascinating, sometimes violent, cultural and religious interplay. The Romanized inhabitants, largely Nicene Christians, found themselves under the rule of an Arian elite. Arianism, a branch of Christianity that held Christ was created by God and thus subordinate, was considered heresy by the Nicene Church, leading to significant religious tension. Imagine the quiet unease in the bustling markets of Merida or Seville, as Roman citizens, accustomed to their familiar rituals and beliefs, observed their new rulers practicing a different form of Christianity. This religious divide was more than just theological. It was a potent symbol of difference, a barrier between conqueror and conquered. However, the Visigothic kings, recognizing the need for stability and legitimacy, gradually began to embrace the Roman legal and administrative structures they encountered. They admired Roman law and sought to adapt it. One of the most significant legal achievements was the Lex Visigothorum, or the Visigothic Code, which began to take shape in the 7th century. This code, unlike earlier Germanic laws, applied to both Goths and Romans, a groundbreaking step towards legal equality and a unified society. It was a remarkable synthesis, blending Roman legal principles with Germanic customs, and it would influence legal systems in Iberia for centuries to come. The path to religious unity was even more arduous. For decades, the Arian kings struggled to convert their Roman subjects, often resorting to coercion. But a profound shift occurred in 587 CE, when King Rekherd I, a figure of immense historical importance, publicly converted from Arianism to Nicene Christianity. This was not merely a personal spiritual journey. It was a calculated political move, a recognition that religious unity was essential for the long-term stability of his kingdom. The Third Council of Toledo in 589 CE, formally sanctioned this conversion, marking a turning point. Imagine the solemn grandeur of the council. Bishops from across the peninsula gathering, debating, and finally celebrating this momentous shift. With this conversion, the religious chasm between ruler and ruled began to close, paving the way for a more cohesive Iberian identity. Yet even with religious and legal unification, the Visigothic kingdom was far from a monolithic entity. It was plagued by internal strife, a recurring theme in its history. Succession to the throne was often contested, leading to frequent assassinations, rebellions, and civil wars. The Visigothic nobility, powerful and often fiercely independent, frequently challenged the authority of the kings. Historians still debate the precise extent to which these internal conflicts weakened the kingdom, making it vulnerable to external threats. Was it the endemic infighting among the nobility, or perhaps the limitations of their administrative structure, that truly undermined their strength? The truth likely lies in a complex interplay of both. One lesser-known detail that offers a glimpse into Visigothic life is their remarkable skill in metalwork, particularly in creating votive crowns. The treasure of Guarazar, discovered in the 19th century, is a stunning collection of these crowns, adorned with jewels and intricate filigree. These weren't worn, but hung above altars as offerings, a testament to their deep religious devotion and sophisticated artistry. Imagine the sunlight catching the polished gold and glittering gemstones, illuminating the solemn interiors of their churches. These crowns, inscribed with the names of kings like Reconquista, speak of a civilization that, despite its political turmoil, possessed a refined aesthetic and a profound spiritual life. The Visigoths also played a crucial role in shaping the intellectual landscape of early medieval Europe. Figures like Isidore of Seville, a towering intellectual of the 7th century, lived and worked under Visigothic rule. His Etymologiae, an encyclopedic work that attempted to compile all knowledge of the ancient world, became a foundational text for medieval scholarship. Imagine Isidore surrounded by scrolls in a quiet monastery, diligently preserving and synthesizing the wisdom of a fading classical age for future generations. His efforts ensured that much of ancient learning survived the tumultuous early medieval period, echoing across the centuries. Despite these achievements, the legal codes, the religious unification, the artistic and intellectual flourishing, the Visigothic kingdom remained fragile. Its military was often decentralized, relying on the loyalty of regional magnates rather than a strong, standing army. Economic structures, while evolving, were still largely agrarian, and trade networks were not as robust as they had been under Roman rule. The kingdom's reach into the far corners of the peninsula, particularly the mountainous north, was often tenuous, leaving pockets of independent communities. As the 7th century drew to a close, the Visigothic kingdom, though seemingly stable, was ripe for disruption. The simmering tensions between factions of the nobility, the occasional persecution of Jewish communities, a dark stain on their legacy, and the inherent weaknesses of a monarchy, often decided by force rather than clear succession laws, all contributed to a sense of underlying instability. The Visigoths had managed to forge a distinct Iberian identity, blending Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements, but it was an identity still in its formative stages, still vulnerable. The final act of the Visigothic drama would unfold with startling speed. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, a new power was rising, fueled by a fervent new faith. The first stirrings of this new force were perhaps barely noticed in the Visigothic court at Toledo, too consumed by its own internal squabbles. but the winds of change were gathering, carrying with them the scent of desert sands and the promise of a different future. The Visigothic kings, for all their efforts to unify and strengthen their realm, would ultimately be unable to withstand the coming storm. Their legacy, however, would endure, woven into the very fabric of the land they ruled, a foundation upon which future civilizations would build. The laws they enacted, the cities they governed, the religious landscape they shaped, all would leave an indelible mark on the peninsula. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The Visigothic kingdom, for all its attempts at unity, was a fragile edifice, its foundations weakened by internal strife and the ever-present tension between the Arian past and the Nicene present. As the 7th century drew to a close, a new power was coalescing across the Strait of Gibraltar, a force that would sweep across the Iberian Peninsula with astonishing speed and reshape its destiny forever. This was the dawn of the Umayyad conquest, a pivotal moment that would not only dismantle the Visigothic order, but also sow the seeds of a new, vibrant civilization, Al-Andalus. The story begins, as many do, with internal conflict. Roderick, the last effective Visigothic king, had ascended to the throne in 710, but not without opposition. A faction of the nobility, perhaps disgruntled by his rise or seeking to regain lost influence, looked south across the narrow waters to the burgeoning Islamic Caliphate. Legends, often embellished over time, speak of a certain Count Julian, governor of Ceuta, whose daughter was allegedly dishonored by Roderick. Whether this tale holds any truth or is merely a dramatic flourish to explain a complex political maneuver, it illustrates the deep divisions that plagued the Visigothic realm. Julian, if the stories are to be believed, sought assistance from Musa ibn Nusayr, the Umayyad governor of Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia. Musa, a seasoned general, recognized an opportunity. The Islamic Caliphate, established after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, had expanded with breathtaking speed, conquering vast swathes of the Middle East and North Africa. The Iberian Peninsula, rich in resources and strategically located, was a tempting prize. In 711, Musa dispatched his Berber general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, with an army of approximately 7,000 men, primarily Berbers recently converted to Islam. They landed at a strategic rock formation that would forever bear Tariq's name, Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq, which we know today as Gibraltar. The Visigothic kingdom, already fractured, was ill-prepared for this new threat. King Roderick, reportedly campaigning against rebellious Basques in the north, rushed south to confront the invaders. The two armies met in July 711 at the Battle of Guadalete, a confrontation whose precise location remains a subject of scholarly debate, though it is generally believed to have occurred near the Barbate River in modern-day Cadiz. The Visigothic forces, though numerically superior, were a disparate collection of levies, many of whom may have harboured little loyalty to Roderick. The battle was a decisive victory for Tariq. King Roderick vanished during the fighting, his fate unknown. Though his demise effectively marked the end of Visigothic rule, the speed of the subsequent conquest was astonishing. Without a central authority to rally resistance, Visigothic cities fell one after another, often with minimal opposition. Some cities, like Córdoba and Toledo, were taken by storm. Others, perhaps seeing the futility of resistance or preferring the new overlords to their existing ones, negotiated surrender terms. These treaties often guaranteed the inhabitants their lives, property, and freedom of worship in exchange for tribute, the jizya for non-Muslims, and kharaj for land tax. This policy of relative tolerance, a hallmark of early Islamic expansion, proved instrumental in the swift consolidation of power. Musa ibn Nusayr himself arrived in 712 with a larger army, and together, he and Tariq systematically subdued the remaining Visigothic strongholds. By 718, most of the Iberian Peninsula, save for the mountainous northern regions of Asturias and the Basque Country, was under Islamic control. The conquest was not merely a military triumph, it was a cultural and political revolution. The Visigothic kingdom, which had struggled for centuries to forge a unified identity, was replaced by a new entity, Al-Andalus, a name derived from an older Germanic term, possibly Vandalicia, referring to the Vandals who had briefly occupied the region. The early years of Al-Andalus were marked by a period of consolidation and at times internal tension between the Arab conquerors and their Berber allies. The Berbers, who formed the bulk of the invading army, often felt marginalized in the distribution of lands and positions of power, leading to occasional uprisings. However, the Umayyad rulers in Damascus, and later the independent Emirate and Caliphate of Córdoba, were remarkably effective in establishing a stable and sophisticated administration. One of the most profound impacts of the conquest was the introduction of a new legal system, Islamic law, Sharia, which coexisted with and gradually influenced existing local customs. Arabic became the language of administration, scholarship, and high culture, gradually supplanting Latin and the various Romance dialects. The new rulers also brought with them advanced agricultural techniques, particularly in irrigation, transforming arid lands into fertile fields. New crops such as citrus fruits, rice, cotton, and sugarcane were introduced, enriching the peninsula's diet and economy. The capital of this new realm was established in Córdoba, a city that would, over the next few centuries, blossom into one of the most magnificent and intellectually vibrant centers of the medieval world. Under the Umayyad emirs and later caliphs, Córdoba became a beacon of learning, attracting scholars, poets, and artists from across the Islamic world and beyond. Its great mosque, begun in 785 by Abd al-Rahman I, stands as a breathtaking testament to the architectural prowess and artistic sensibilities of Al-Andalus, its forest of arches a symphony of stone and light. The establishment of Al-Andalus also ushered in a period of remarkable cultural fusion. While Islamic culture dominated, it did not entirely erase the existing traditions. Mozarabs, Christians living under Muslim rule, maintained their faith and many of their customs, though they gradually adopted Arabic language and elements of Islamic culture. Jews, who had faced varying degrees of persecution under the Visigoths, often found a more tolerant environment under Islamic rule, contributing significantly to the intellectual and economic life of Al-Andalus. This period of relative coexistence, often termed convivencia, though historians still debate the extent and nature of this harmony, allowed for a rich exchange of ideas and knowledge. A less commonly known detail about the early conquest is the role of the Visigothic aristocracy. While many fled north or were killed, some Visigothic nobles, particularly those who had opposed Roderick, collaborated with the conquerors, converting to Islam and maintaining their landholdings and influence. These muwaladun, or converts, formed a significant part of the new Andalusian society, further blurring the lines between conqueror and conquered. Their integration into the new social fabric highlights the complex and often pragmatic nature of the conquest, which was not simply a clash of civilizations, but a multifaceted process of assimilation and adaptation. The Umayyad conquest was not without its limits. The mountainous regions of the far north, particularly Asturias, remained unconquered. Here, a small pocket of Visigothic resistance, led by a nobleman named Pelagius, managed to hold out. In 722, at the Battle of Covadonga, Pelagius's forces ambushed a Muslim detachment, securing a minor victory that, though militarily insignificant at the time, would later be hailed as the symbolic beginning of the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain. This small, resilient kingdom of Asturias would become the seed from which future Christian kingdoms would grow, eventually challenging and ultimately overcoming Al-Andalus. The expansion of Umayyad power into Europe was eventually halted further north. In 732, a Muslim army under Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, advanced deep into Gaul, modern-day France. They were decisively defeated by the Frankish forces led by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers. This battle, often portrayed as a pivotal moment that saved Christian Europe from Islamic conquest, marked the high watermark of Umayyad expansion into Western Europe. While its long-term strategic importance is sometimes debated by historians, some argue the Muslim forces were already overextended and their defeat was inevitable regardless. It undeniably prevented the establishment of a lasting Islamic presence north of the Pyrenees. Back in Al-Andalus, the political landscape continued to evolve. In 750, a revolution in the east led to the overthrow of the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus by the Abbasids. Almost the entire Umayyad royal family was massacred, but one young prince, Abd al-Rahman I, managed to escape. After years of perilous wandering, he arrived in Al-Andalus in 755, where he found support among the Umayyad loyalists and, crucially, the Syrian Arab factions who had settled in the peninsula. In 756, he declared himself Emir of Córdoba, establishing an independent Umayyad emirate that would rule Al-Andalus for nearly 3 centuries. This act of defiance effectively severed Al-Andalus from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, allowing it to forge its own distinct identity and pursue its own destiny. Abd al-Rahman I, known as the Immigrant or the Falcon of Quraysh, for his daring escape and establishment of a new dynasty, was a formidable ruler. He spent much of his reign consolidating his power, quelling internal rebellions, and establishing a strong, centralized administration. He understood the importance of projecting power and legitimacy. It was under his patronage that the Great Mosque of Córdoba began to take shape, a monumental project that symbolized the new era of Islamic rule and the burgeoning prosperity of Al-Andalus. The birth of Al-Andalus was not merely a change of rulers, it was the genesis of a unique civilization. It was a place where Eastern and Western influences mingled, where the intellectual traditions of the classical world were preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, and where a new architectural and artistic aesthetic flourished. The fertile lands, the sophisticated irrigation systems, the bustling markets, and the intellectual ferment all contributed to an era of unparalleled prosperity and cultural brilliance. The cities of Al-Andalus became centers of innovation. In medicine, scholars like Ibn Avenzoar, in the 12th century, a physician from Seville, made significant contributions to clinical medicine and pharmacology. In mathematics, the introduction of Indian numerals, which we now call Arabic numerals, and the concept of zero revolutionized calculations. Astronomy flourished, with observatories and astrolabes used to chart the heavens. Philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle, was translated and commented upon by great thinkers like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Maimonides, whose ideas would later profoundly influence European scholasticism. The very air of Al-Andalus seemed to hum with intellectual curiosity. Libraries, like the one established by Caliph Al-Hakam II in Córdoba, housed hundreds of thousands of volumes, far surpassing any contemporary European collection. Poets like Ibn Zaydun and Walada bint al-Mustakfi crafted exquisite verses, their words painting vivid pictures of love, nature, and the beauty of their world. Musicians developed new forms and instruments, their melodies echoing through the courtyards and palaces. Yet, beneath this veneer of brilliance, tensions always simmered. The convivencia, while often celebrated, was a complex and sometimes fragile arrangement. Religious minorities, though protected, were still second-class citizens, subject to specific laws and taxes. Internal divisions among the Arab, Berber, and Muayyad populations, often exacerbated by tribal loyalties and political ambitions, would periodically erupt into conflict. The nascent Christian kingdoms in the north, though small, never truly ceased their efforts to reclaim the lost territories. Their presence, a constant low-level threat. The establishment of Al-Andalus, therefore, marked a profound turning point in Iberian history. It was a period of dramatic transformation, where a new religion, a new language, and a new culture took root and flourished, creating a society of unparalleled sophistication in medieval Europe. The echoes of this vibrant civilization, its architectural wonders, its intellectual achievements, and its unique cultural blend would resonate across the peninsula and beyond for centuries to come, shaping the very identity of Spain and leaving an indelible mark on the tapestry of world history. The world had shifted, and the peninsula, once a distant outpost of a struggling empire, was now a shining jewel in the crown of the Islamic world, a place where the stars seemed to whisper secrets of knowledge and beauty to those who listened. The morning sun, when it finally broke over the Sierra Morena, cast long shadows across a land transformed. The Umayyad Emirate, established by Abd al-Rahman I, had blossomed into a civilization of unparalleled sophistication, reaching its zenith under the Caliphate of Córdoba. This was not merely a political entity, but a vibrant tapestry woven from diverse threads, where the pursuit of knowledge and beauty was as revered as military prowess. For nearly 3 centuries, the plough of unparalleled social and peaceful people. From the mid-8th to the early 11th century, Al-Andalus, and particularly its capital, Córdoba, stood as a beacon of light in a Europe often described as languishing in the Dark Ages. Imagine Córdoba in the 10th century, a city that dwarfed any other in Western Europe. Its population, perhaps 500,000 souls, bustled through streets paved and lit at night, a luxury unknown even in Paris or London at the time. The air would have been thick with the scent of jasmine and orange blossoms from countless gardens, mingling with the aroma of spices from distant lands carried by merchants. Water, a precious commodity, flowed freely through an intricate network of aqueducts and fountains, gurgling softly in courtyards and public squares. This was a city of baths, of libraries, of scholars and artisans, where the sounds of different languages, Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, Mozarabic, intertwined in a harmonious murmur. The great mosque of Córdoba, Mezquita, stood as the architectural heart of this golden age. Its forest of horseshoe arches, crafted from jasper, onyx, marble and granite, seemed to stretch into infinity, each column a silent testament to the skill and vision of its builders. Begun by Abd al-Rahman I in 785 on the site of a Visigothic church, it was expanded over generations, culminating in the breathtaking mihrab and its dazzling mosaics, added by Al-Hakam II in the mid-10th century. These mosaics, gifted by the Byzantine emperor, shimmered with gold and vibrant colors, depicting intricate geometric patterns and calligraphic verses from the Quran, creating an otherworldly sense of sacred space. The mosque was not just a place of worship, it was a university, a court of law, a public forum, and a symbol of the Caliphate's power and cultural sophistication. The intellectual flourishing of Córdoba was truly remarkable. While much of Christian Europe relied on oral traditions and a handful of monastic scriptoria, Al-Andalus embraced the written word with an almost feverish passion. Libraries were not just repositories of texts, they were centers of scholarship, translation, and debate. The library of Caliph Al-Hakam II, for instance, was said to contain over 400,000 volumes, a staggering number for its time. Scribes worked tirelessly, copying ancient Greek and Roman texts, as well as original works by Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars. This vast collection covered every conceivable field: philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, botany, history, and poetry. Without the meticulous preservation and translation efforts of scholars in Al-Andalus, many classical texts, particularly those of Aristotle and Plato, might have been lost to the Western world forever. This intellectual curiosity fostered an environment of religious tolerance, or convivencia, a term often used to describe the coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Al-Andalus. While it was not a perfect utopia, and periods of tension certainly existed, for much of the Caliphate's zenith, these communities largely coexisted, contributing to the vibrant cultural mosaic. Jewish scholars like Maimonides, though he lived slightly later, his family hailed from Córdoba, and Christian intellectuals, known as Mozarabs, participated in the intellectual life of the Caliphate, often writing in Arabic and contributing to the scientific and philosophical advancements. They served in the Caliph's court, worked as physicians, translated texts, and enriched the cultural landscape. This intermingling of ideas was a powerful catalyst for innovation. In the realm of science, Al-Andalus was centuries ahead of its European counterparts. Physicians like Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, known in the West as Abul Qasis, revolutionized surgery. His monumental work, Al-Tasrif, a 30-volume medical encyclopedia completed around 1000 CE, detailed surgical procedures, instruments, and pharmaceutical preparations. It became a foundational text for European medical schools for centuries, illustrating surgical techniques for everything from dentistry to complex bone fractures. Astronomers meticulously mapped the stars, building sophisticated observatories and refining astronomical tables. Mathematicians introduced Arabic numerals, which were, in fact, Indian in origin, but transmitted to Europe via Arab scholars, and the concept of zero, fundamentally transforming calculations and paving the way for algebra. The very word algebra comes from the Arabic al-jaba. Agriculture also underwent a revolution. Andalusian farmers, drawing on sophisticated irrigation techniques learned from the Near East, transformed arid lands into fertile gardens. They introduced new crops like rice, sugarcane, cotton, oranges, lemons, and artichokes, which not only diversified the local diet, but also created new industries. The famous gardens of the Generalife in Granada, though built later, are a testament to the Andalusian mastery of water management and landscape design, creating paradisiacal oases. The Caliphate reached its political and cultural peak under Abd al-Rahman III, who declared himself Caliph in 929, asserting his independence from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and challenging the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa. This declaration was a bold statement, not just of political autonomy, but of cultural supremacy. Abd al-Rahman III was a shrewd diplomat and a formidable military leader, who brought stability and prosperity to Al-Andalus after a period of internal strife. He established a powerful, centralized government, a strong army, and a thriving economy fueled by trade and advanced agriculture. His reign also saw the construction of Madinat al-Zahra, a magnificent palace city built just outside Córdoba. Legend has it that Abd al-Rahman III ordered its construction in honor of his favorite concubine, Zahra, though its true purpose was to serve as a grand administrative center and a dazzling display of the Caliphate's power and wealth. Begun in 936, it was a city within a city, featuring opulent palaces, mosques, administrative buildings, barracks, gardens, and artificial lakes. Its ruins, though largely destroyed within a century of its construction, still hint at its former glory, with intricate carvings, marble imported from distant lands, and elaborate water features. The sheer scale and artistry of Madinat al-Zahra were intended to awe visitors and reinforce the Caliph's authority. Historians still debate the exact reasons for its sudden and dramatic abandonment and destruction. Was it purely political instability, or perhaps the immense cost of its upkeep in a time of growing economic strain? The truth likely lies in a complex interplay of factors. The Golden Age, however, was not destined to last forever. The very diversity that fueled its brilliance also contained the seeds of its eventual fragmentation. As the 11th century dawned, the centralized power of the Caliphate began to wane. Internal divisions, fueled by ethnic tensions between Arabs, Berbers, and Slavs, many of whom served in the caliphal army and administration, and exacerbated by ambitious regional governors, led to a period of civil war known as the Fitna. The last Umayyad Caliph of Córdoba was deposed in 1031, and the Caliphate dissolved into a multitude of independent, smaller Islamic states known as the Taifa kingdoms. These Taifa kingdoms, though politically weaker and often warring amongst themselves, continued to be centers of culture and learning, albeit on a smaller scale. Cities like Seville, Granada, Toledo, and Zaragoza each developed their own distinctive artistic and intellectual styles, often competing to attract the best scholars and artists. This fragmentation, however, made them vulnerable. To the north, the Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre were slowly but steadily consolidating their power, emboldened by the internal divisions of Al-Andalus. The Reconquista, which had been a slow, sporadic process for centuries, was about to gain significant momentum. One lesser-known detail from this period is the role of paper manufacturing. While paper had been invented in China and introduced to the Islamic world in the 8th century. It was in Al-Andalus that its production truly flourished in Europe. The first paper mill in Europe was established in Yativa, in the 10th century. Before this, parchment made from animal skins was the primary writing material in Europe, expensive and laborious to produce. The widespread availability of paper in Al-Andalus revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge, making books more accessible and contributing significantly to the Caliphate's intellectual vibrancy. It was from Al-Andalus that paper-making technology gradually spread northward into Christian Europe, though it took centuries for it to become as prevalent. The legacy of the Caliphate of Córdoba is immense. It was a bridge between East and West, a crucible where ancient knowledge was preserved, new ideas were forged, and diverse cultures interacted. Its architectural marvels, its scientific advancements, its philosophical inquiries, and its literary achievements left an indelible mark on the Iberian Peninsula and indeed on the entire Western world. The soft glow of its libraries and the murmur of its scholars echoed through the centuries, reminding us of a time when the pursuit of knowledge illuminated a path forward. Even as political power shifted and the landscape of Spain began to change, the seeds of innovation and beauty planted during this golden age would continue to bear fruit, shaping the future in ways its architects could scarcely have imagined. The fall of the Caliphate was not an end, but a transformation, setting the stage for new struggles and new glories. The glittering tapestry of Al-Andalus, once woven with threads of unified power, began to fray. The 11th century dawned upon a land in transition, a period of profound fragmentation that would reshape the Iberian Peninsula for centuries to come. The mighty Caliphate of Córdoba, that beacon of learning and splendor, had buckled under its own weight, torn apart by internal strife, ambitious regional governors, and the ever-present tensions between its diverse ethnic and religious groups. By 1031, the last Umayyad Caliph was deposed, and the centralized authority that had held Al-Andalus together for so long dissolved into a kaleidoscopic array of independent city-states known as the Taifa kingdoms. Imagine a mosaic shattering into 1,000 brilliant pieces, each reflecting a unique hue, yet no longer part of a cohesive whole. This was the fate of Al-Andalus. From the grand cities of Seville, Granada, Toledo, and Zaragoza, to smaller, strategically vital towns, each declared its own sovereignty. These Taifa kingdoms, often no larger than a modern province, were ruled by emirs, who, in many cases, had once been governors or military commanders under the Caliphate. They were a diverse lot. Some were Arab, tracing their lineage back to the original conquerors. Others were Berber, descendants of the North African tribes who had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and a few were Saqaliba, former European slaves who had risen through the ranks to seize power. This fragmentation, while politically destabilizing, paradoxically ushered in a period of intense cultural and intellectual flourishing in many Taifa courts. Each emir, keen to legitimize his rule and outshine his rivals, became a patron of the arts, sciences, and literature. Seville, under the Abbadids, became a center of poetic excellence, its gardens echoing with verses and its libraries overflowing with manuscripts. Toledo, though eventually falling to Christian forces, was a melting pot of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars, where knowledge was exchanged and translated with an unprecedented fervor. Granada, under the Zirids and later the Nasrids, began to lay the foundations for the architectural wonders that would define it for centuries. Yet, this cultural brilliance was often overshadowed by political fragility and constant internecine warfare. The Taifa kings, lacking the military might of the unified Caliphate, frequently found themselves in precarious positions. They formed shifting alliances, often against each other, and sometimes even sought assistance from the burgeoning Christian kingdoms to their north. This was a dangerous game for the Christian kings, who had long been confined to the mountainous fringes of the peninsula, watched the disintegration of Al-Andalus with keen interest and growing ambition. From the rugged Cantabrian mountains in the west and the Pyrenees in the east, the small Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon had been slowly consolidating their power. For centuries, their existence had been precarious, often paying tribute to the powerful Caliphate. But as Al-Andalus fractured, a new sense of opportunity, and indeed a religious zeal, began to take root. This was the dawn of the Reconquista, a centuries-long process of Christian expansion that would fundamentally alter the demographic and political landscape of the Iberian Peninsula. The early phases of the Reconquista were less about grand crusades and more about opportunistic expansion, driven by a mix of religious fervor, territorial ambition, and the lure of fertile lands and wealthy cities. The Christian kings, often depicted as valiant crusaders, were also pragmatic rulers, willing to exploit the divisions among the Taifa kingdoms. They would demand parias, tribute payments, from the weaker Taifa rulers in exchange for protection against their Muslim rivals, or sometimes even against other Christian lords. These payments, often in gold, silver, and luxury goods, flowed north, enriching the Christian treasuries and funding their nascent armies. One of the most significant early victories for the Christian kingdoms came in 1085 with the fall of Toledo. This ancient city, strategically located in the heart of the peninsula and a vibrant intellectual hub, had long been a symbol of Muslim power in the north. Its capture by King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile was a monumental event, sending shockwaves across both Christian and Muslim worlds. Toledo's surrender was not a bloody conquest in the traditional sense. Rather, it was the culmination of years of political maneuvering and the exploitation of the city's internal weaknesses. The Taifa ruler of Toledo, Al-Qadir, had been caught between warring factions and had ultimately sought Alfonso's protection, leading to the city's eventual absorption into the Castilian kingdom. The fall of Toledo was more than just a territorial gain. It was a psychological turning point. It demonstrated that the Christian kingdoms were not merely content with raiding and tribute, but were capable of conquering and holding major Muslim cities. It also exposed the profound vulnerability of the Taifa kingdoms, who, despite their individual brilliance, were unable to mount a unified defense. The loss of Toledo, a city that had for centuries been a beacon of Islamic culture, was a stark warning of the shifting balance of power. Historians still debate the precise nature of the Reconquista in its early stages. Was it primarily a religious crusade, a holy war to reclaim lands for Christendom? Or was it a more pragmatic expansion driven by feudal ambitions and the desire for wealth and territory? The truth, as often happens in history, likely lies somewhere in between. A complex interplay of motives. While religious rhetoric certainly played a role, especially as the centuries progressed and the papacy became more involved, the early Reconquista was often characterized by a more fluid coexistence and even cooperation between Christian and Muslim rulers when it suited their political ends. The legendary figure of El Cid, for instance, a Castilian knight, famously fought for both Christian and Muslim lords, embodying this complex reality. The fall of Toledo, however, undeniably marked a new chapter. It signaled to the Taifa kings that their internal squabbles and reliance on Christian mercenaries were unsustainable. Faced with an increasingly aggressive Christian front, some Taifa rulers, in a desperate bid to preserve their independence, looked across the Strait of Gibraltar for help. Their pleas were answered by the Almoravids, a powerful Berber dynasty from North Africa, who had recently forged a vast empire. The arrival of the Almoravids in Al-Andalus in 1086 was a dramatic intervention. Invited by the Taifa kings to repel the Christian advance, they were initially welcomed as saviors. Their leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, was a formidable warrior and a devout Muslim who viewed the Taifa rulers' lavish lifestyles and their willingness to pay tribute to Christians with disdain. He saw himself as a purifier, restoring strict Islamic law and unity to a land he believed had strayed from the true path. The Almoravids' impact was immediate and decisive. At the Battle of Sagrajas, also known as Zalaka in 1086, a combined Almoravid and Taifa army inflicted a crushing defeat on Alfonso VI's Castilian forces. This battle temporarily halted the Christian advance and bought Al-Andalus some much-needed breathing room. The victory was celebrated throughout the Muslim world as a divine intervention, a testament to the power of unified faith. However, the relief of the Taifa kings was short-lived. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, having witnessed the political weakness and perceived moral decay of the Taifa courts, soon turned his attention to them. He systematically deposed the Taifa rulers, absorbing their kingdoms into his burgeoning Almoravid empire. By the early 12th century, the fragmented Taifa kingdoms had been replaced by a new, unified, and more austere North African rule. This marked the end of the first Taifa period and the beginning of a new era of centralized power in Al-Andalus, albeit one dominated by an external force. The Almoravid rule, while bringing a degree of military stability and a stricter adherence to Islamic law, was not universally welcomed. Many Andalusis, accustomed to the more tolerant and a culturally rich atmosphere of the Taifa courts, resented the Almoravids' puritanical approach and their heavy-handed administration. The intellectual and artistic flourishing that had characterized the Taifa period began to wane under the more rigid Almoravid regime. Though it certainly did not disappear entirely. The Reconquista, however, was not a linear process. The Christian kingdoms, though temporarily checked by the Almoravids, continued their expansion where they could, often exploiting the friction between the new North African rulers and the local Andalusi population. The centuries of the Reconquista would be marked by periods of intense warfare, followed by periods of uneasy truce and even cultural exchange. The very concept of a continuous, unbroken reconquest has been the subject of much scholarly debate, with some historians arguing for a more nuanced understanding of a complex, multifaceted process of territorial expansion, migration, and cultural interaction. One fascinating yet lesser-known detail from this period concerns the intricate networks of spies and diplomats that operated between the Christian and Muslim courts. These were not just battlefields of swords and arrows, but also of words and whispers. Emissaries, often disguised, would travel between kingdoms, gathering intelligence, negotiating alliances, and even arranging marriages. Imagine the tension in the royal courts as these figures, often fluent in multiple languages, delivered messages that could ignite wars or forge fragile peace. These individuals, often unsung, played a crucial role in shaping the political landscape, their lives a constant tightrope walk between loyalty and betrayal. The period of the Taifa kingdoms and the early Reconquista truly laid the groundwork for the future of the Iberian Peninsula. It was a time of immense change, where the old order crumbled, giving way to a dynamic and often violent struggle for dominance. The cultural legacy of the Taifas, with their vibrant courts and intellectual pursuits, continued to echo through the centuries, even as their political independence was lost. And the Christian kingdoms, emboldened by their early victories and fueled by a growing sense of religious mission, had set in motion a process that would ultimately redefine the peninsula's identity. The seeds of a new Spain, both Christian and Muslim, were being sown in the shifting sands of this turbulent era. The mountains to the north, once a barrier, had become a launching pad, and the sun-drenched plains of Al-Andalus, once a unified garden, were now a contested landscape, each piece of the shattered mosaic vying for its own light. The 11th century, a time of blossoming culture and splintering power, had seen Al-Andalus fragment into a mosaic of Taifa kingdoms. These small, often squabbling emirates, though vibrant in their artistic and intellectual pursuits, were militarily vulnerable. To the north, the Christian kingdoms, emboldened by their successes and unified by a shared faith, pressed ever southward. The fall of Toledo in 1085 to Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. It was a city of immense symbolic and strategic importance, a jewel that had once shone brightly under Islamic rule. Its loss was a stark reminder that the tide was turning, and the fragmented Taifas, unable to stem the Christian advance on their own, looked to cross the Strait of Gibraltar for help. Their pleas found a receptive ear in Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the formidable leader of the Almoravids. This was a new power, born from the ascetic fervour of the Sanhaja Berber tribes of the Sahara. The Almoravids, whose name in Arabic, al-Murabitan, referred to those who dwell in a ribat, a fortified monastery or frontier outpost, were driven by a stern, puritanical interpretation of Islam. They emerged from the vast, sun-drenched emptiness of the desert, a land where faith was often forged in hardship and simplicity. Their rise was swift and decisive. From their humble beginnings in the mid-11th century, they had carved out a vast empire that stretched across North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the heart of the Maghreb. They had built Marrakesh, a city that would become a beacon of their power, a bustling hub where desert winds met the whispers of distant lands. In 1086, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, answering the desperate call of the Taifa kings, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with his disciplined, battle-hardened army. The encounter that followed at Sagregas, or Zalaka, as it was known in Arabic, near Badajoz, was a pivotal moment. The Almoravid forces, augmented by the Taifa contingents, faced the combined armies of Alfonso VI. The battle was fierce, the clash of cultures and military traditions. The Almoravids, with their disciplined ranks and unwavering faith, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Christian forces. It was a victory that momentarily halted the Christian Reconquista, a powerful reassertion of Islamic military might on the Iberian Peninsula. For a brief, exhilarating period, it seemed as though the tide had turned once more. However, the Almoravids had not come merely as saviours. Their puritanical zeal found the luxurious, often decadent, lifestyles of the Taifa kings deeply offensive. They viewed the Taifa's willingness to pay parias, tributes, to Christian rulers as a betrayal of Islamic principles. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, seeing the disunity and weakness of the Taifas, soon decided that a more permanent solution was necessary. Between 1090 and 1110, the Almoravids systematically dismantled the Taifa kingdoms, absorbing them into their vast North African empire. Seville fell in 1091, followed by Granada, Córdoba, and the other major cities. This marked a profound shift. Al-Andalus was no longer a collection of independent states, but a province of a larger, more austere empire governed from Marrakesh. The Almoravid rule brought a period of renewed Islamic unity and military strength to Al-Andalus. They fortified cities, reorganized the administration, and enforced a stricter interpretation of Islamic law. The artistic and intellectual vibrancy of the Taifa period, while not entirely extinguished, was somewhat subdued by their more conservative outlook. Yet their presence was not universally welcomed. Many Andalusis, accustomed to the relative autonomy and sophisticated culture of the Taifas, resented the imposition of foreign rule and the stricter religious doctrines. The Almoravids, though effective warriors, were seen by some as unrefined desert dwellers, lacking the cultural finesse of the established Andalusi elite. Despite their initial successes, the Almoravid Empire in Al-Andalus began to show cracks by the early 12th century. Internal dissent, the vastness of their empire, and the relentless pressure from the Christian kingdoms to the north all contributed to their decline. The Christian kingdoms, though chastened by Sagradas, had not been broken. They regrouped, learned from their defeats, and continued their southward expansion, albeit at a slower pace. The Almoravids found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, stretched thin across their North African and Iberian domains. As the Almoravid power waned, another powerful movement was rising in the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, the Almohads. Like the Almoravids, they were a Berber dynasty, but their religious doctrine was even more rigorously Unitarian, emphasizing the absolute oneness of God, Tawhid. Their name, Al-Muwahhidun, literally means the monotheists, or those who affirm the unity of God. Led by their spiritual founder Ibn Tumat and later by Abd al-Mu'min, the Almohads presented themselves as reformers, seeking to purify Islam from what they saw as the deviations and laxity of the Almoravids. They condemned the Almoravids' theological interpretations and their perceived corruption. By the mid-12th century, the Almohads had overthrown the Almoravids in North Africa, establishing their own powerful empire. Just as the Taifas had sought Almoravid aid, a new wave of internal strife and Christian pressure in Al-Andalus led some Andalusi leaders to appeal to the rising Almohad power. In 1146, the Almohads crossed into Al-Andalus, initially invited to help quell local rebellions and Christian incursions. However, like their predecessors, they soon moved to establish their own direct rule. They systematically conquered the remaining Almoravid strongholds and the new, short-lived Second Taifa kingdoms that had emerged during the Almoravid decline. By 1172, the Almohads had firmly established their dominion over Al-Andalus, creating an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the Ebro River in Spain. The Almohad period in Al-Andalus, lasting from the mid-12th to the early 13th century, was characterized by a renewed period of Islamic cultural and intellectual flourishing, albeit under a stricter religious framework. Their capital in Al-Andalus was Seville, which they transformed into a magnificent city, commissioning grand architectural projects like the Giralda, the minaret of the Great Mosque, which still stands today as a testament to their engineering prowess and artistic vision. They fostered scholarship, particularly in philosophy, mathematics, and medicine. Great thinkers like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the renowned philosopher and commentator on Aristotle, and Maimonides, the celebrated Jewish scholar, physician, and philosopher, lived and worked under Almohad rule, though Maimonides eventually left due to the stricter religious climate. The Almohads, like the Almoravids before them, were formidable warriors. They understood the existential threat posed by the Christian kingdoms and launched several successful campaigns against them. The Battle of Alarcos in 1195 was a resounding Almohad victory, where their forces, led by Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, decisively defeated the Castilian army of Alfonso VIII. This victory once again stalled the Christian Reconquista and demonstrated the continued strength of Islamic military power in Iberia. For a moment, it seemed that Al-Andalus might yet endure as a powerful Islamic state. However, the Almohad Empire, despite its initial vigor, faced significant challenges. Their strict religious doctrines, while unifying to their core followers, often alienated the diverse populations of Al-Andalus, including Christians and Jews, and even many Muslims who found their interpretations overly rigid. The sheer size of their empire made it difficult to govern effectively, and internal rebellions in North Africa constantly diverted resources and attention. Perhaps the most significant challenge, however, came from the increasingly unified and determined Christian kingdoms to the north. The Christian kingdoms, particularly Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre, viewed the Almohads as a grave threat, a powerful and unified force that needed to be decisively defeated. The Pope, Innocent III, called for a crusade against the Almohads, rallying Christian knights from across Europe to join the fight. This call for a holy war galvanized the Christian kingdoms, overcoming their own internal rivalries for a common cause. The culmination of this renewed Christian resistance came in 1212 at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. This was a monumental clash, one of the most decisive battles in the history of the Reconquista. The combined armies of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Leon, bolstered by foreign crusaders, faced the vast Almohad army. The battle was long and brutal, a desperate struggle for control of the Iberian Peninsula. The Christian forces, despite initial setbacks, ultimately achieved a crushing victory. The Almohad army was routed, their power broken. The defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa was a catastrophic blow from which the Almohad Empire in Al-Andalus never truly recovered. The aftermath of Las Navas de Tolosa was swift and devastating for the Almohads. Their authority in Al-Andalus collapsed rapidly. Within a few decades, most of the major cities of Al-Andalus fell to the Christian kingdoms. Córdoba, the ancient heart of the Caliphate, fell to Ferdinand III of Castile in 1236. Valencia fell to James I of Aragon in 1238. Seville, the Almohad capital, surrendered to Ferdinand III in 1248 after a long siege. The once vast Almohad Empire in Iberia crumbled, leaving only the small Nasrid kingdom of Granada as the last vestige of Muslim rule. Historians still debate the precise reasons for the ultimate failure of both the Almoravids and the Almohads to permanently hold Al-Andalus. Was it their foreignness, their inability to fully integrate with the established Andalusi culture? Was it the inherent difficulty of maintaining such a vast empire across a strait, constantly battling on two fronts? Or was it simply the overwhelming and sustained pressure from the increasingly unified and militarily effective Christian kingdoms? Each of these factors undoubtedly played a role. The Almoravids and Almohads, despite their military prowess and the initial revitalization they brought to Islamic Spain, ultimately faced a foe that was not only religiously motivated, but also increasingly organized and determined. The arrival of these powerful North African Berber empires fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of Al-Andalus. They brought a renewed sense of religious purpose and military strength, temporarily stemming the Christian advance and giving Islamic Spain a new lease on life. Their architectural and intellectual contributions, particularly those of the Almohads, left an indelible mark on the landscape and culture of the region. Yet, their presence also highlighted the deep divisions within Al-Andalus and the growing power of the Christian kingdoms. The Almoravids and Almohads, though they came as saviors, ultimately paved the way for the final, decisive phase of the Reconquista. The vibrant, multifaceted tapestry of Al-Andalus, though still beautiful, was slowly but inexorably being unraveled, thread by thread, by the relentless march of time and the shifting sands of power. The echoes of their battles, the whispers of their prayers, and the grandeur of their cities still resonate across the Iberian landscape, silent witnesses to a pivotal chapter in its long and complex story. As the dust settled from the initial fervor of the Reconquista, a new landscape began to emerge in the northern reaches of the Iberian Peninsula. The small, resilient Christian enclaves, once clinging precariously to the mountainous fringes, had begun to coalesce into formidable kingdoms. No longer merely a collection of defiant strongholds, these nascent states, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal, were now forging distinct identities, each with its own character, ambitions, and destiny. Castile, born from the heartland of the old Asturian kingdom and named for its countless frontier castles, was perhaps the most aggressive and expansionist. Its very name, Castilla, meaning land of castles, spoke to its martial spirit and its strategic importance as a bulwark against Al-Andalus. From the 11th century onward, Castile's kings, like Fernando I and Alfonso VI, spearheaded much of the Christian advance, pushing south with a relentless drive that would eventually define the peninsula's future. The capture of Toledo in 1085 by Alfonso VI was a pivotal moment, not just a military victory, but a symbolic one, reclaiming a city that had been a vibrant centre of Visigothic power. This conquest brought vast new territories under Castilian rule, along with a significant Muslim population and their rich cultural heritage, which began to subtly influence Castilian society, art, and even language. The Castilian legal system, embodied in codes like the Fuero Juzgo, derived from the Visigothic Lex Visigothorum, evolved to integrate these new realities, attempting to establish a framework for governing diverse populations. Meanwhile, to the east, the Kingdom of Aragon was developing a different character. Emerging from the Pyrenean valleys, Aragon initially shared borders and often intertwined destinies with Navarre. However, its gaze soon turned eastward and southward, towards the Mediterranean and the fertile lands of the Ebro Valley. The union of the County of Barcelona with the Kingdom of Aragon in 1137, through the marriage of Petronila of Aragon and Ramon Berenguer IV, Count of Barcelona, was a transformative event. This created the Crown of Aragon, a powerful entity that combined Aragon's landlocked military strength with Catalonia's maritime prowess and commercial acumen. This dual nature would define Aragon's expansion, which often took a different path than Castile's, embracing naval power and Mediterranean trade. While Castile pushed south over land, Aragon looked to the sea, establishing a vast commercial and political network that would eventually encompass the Balearic Islands, Valencia, Sicily, Sardinia, and even parts of Greece. Navarre, nestled in the Western Pyrenees, maintained a more modest, though no less significant, presence, often caught between the ambitions of its larger neighbours, Castile and Aragon, as well as France. Navarre's history was one of strategic alliances and careful diplomacy. Its geographic position made it a crucial gateway between Iberia and the rest of Europe, and its kings, like Sancho III the Great in the early 11th century, briefly extended Navarre's influence across much of northern Spain. However, by the 12th and 13th centuries, Navarre's territorial ambitions were largely curtailed, and it focused more on consolidating its internal structures and maintaining its independence. Its legal traditions, such as the Fuero General de Navarra, reflected a strong emphasis on local customs and communal rights, the testament to its distinct identity. And then there was Portugal, a kingdom that forged its identity through a fierce determination to be distinct from its Castilian neighbour. Initially a county within the Kingdom of Leon, Portugal's independence was formally recognised in 1143 with the Treaty of Zamora, a landmark agreement between Afonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, and Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile. This moment marked the birth of a nation that would look westward, towards the Atlantic rather than solely south. Portugal's Reconquista was largely completed by the mid-13th century, culminating in the capture of the Algarve. Unlike Castile and Aragon, which continued to eye each other's territories, and the remaining Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, Portugal's borders became largely fixed. This early completion of its internal territorial expansion allowed Portugal to turn its energies outward towards maritime exploration and trade, setting the stage for its later role as a global seafaring power. Each of these kingdoms developed distinct legal systems that reflected their unique historical trajectories and societal structures. Castile, with its vast and diverse territories, gradually moved towards a more centralized legal framework. Though local fueros, charters of rights and privileges, remained important, the Siete Partidas, compiled in the 13th century under Alfonso II, was a monumental legal code that sought to unify Castilian law, drawing heavily from Roman and canon law, and profoundly influenced legal thought across Europe. It was a comprehensive work, covering everything from royal power to family law, and its ambition reflected Castile's growing sense of imperial destiny. Aragon, by contrast, maintained a more decentralized legal tradition, respecting the distinct fueros of its constituent parts, Aragon proper, Catalonia, and Valencia. The Aragonese Cortes, a representative assembly, held significant power, often acting as a check on royal authority. This emphasis on contractual relationships between the monarch and the nobility, and between the crown and its various territories, gave the Crown of Aragon a unique constitutional character, often described as a pactist monarchy. This meant that the king's power was not absolute, but was bound by agreements and laws established with the Cortes. Navarre's legal system, as mentioned, was characterized by its strong local customs and communal rights, enshrined in its Fuero General. This legal conservatism helped preserve its identity amidst powerful neighbours. Portugal, too, developed its own legal codes, often drawing inspiration from Castilian models, but adapting them to its specific needs and consolidating royal authority over time. Military prowess was a defining characteristic of all these emerging kingdoms. The constant warfare against Al-Andalus, and often against each other, honed their martial skills and fostered a warrior ethos. Knights, fortified castles, and disciplined infantry were the backbone of their armies. The military orders, like the Knights of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcántara in Castile, and the Order of Christ in Portugal, which succeeded the Knights Templar, played a crucial role, combining religious zeal with military might. Becoming powerful landholders and significant forces in the Reconquista. These orders were not just fighting units, they were also economic powers, managing vast estates and contributing to the settlement and defense of newly conquered lands. One lesser-known detail from this period concerns the repopulation efforts. As Christian armies advanced, they didn't just conquer, they actively resettled the land with Christian populations. This wasn't simply a matter of moving people. It involved elaborate systems of land grants, tax incentives, and the creation of new towns and villages, often with special charters, fueros, designed to attract settlers. For example, in the newly conquered lands of Extremadura or the Duero Basin, kings would offer land and privileges to anyone willing to move south and defend the frontier. These fueros often granted significant autonomy to the new settlements, fostering a sense of local identity and self-governance that would endure for centuries. These charters were not just legal documents, they were instruments of social engineering, shaping the demographic and economic landscape of the peninsula. The development of distinct identities for these kingdoms was a gradual process, shaped by geography, language, legal traditions, and the personalities of their rulers. While they shared a common Christian faith and a common enemy in Al-Andalus, their internal dynamics and external ambitions often diverged. The Castilian dialect, for instance, began its ascent as the dominant language of the peninsula, spreading south with its armies, while Catalan flourished in the crown of Aragon, and Portuguese developed its own unique character. A scholarly dispute that often arises when discussing this period is the extent to which the Reconquista was a unified national project versus a series of independent, often competing, territorial expansions. Historians still debate whether the Christian kingdoms truly saw themselves as fighting for a common cause, or if their primary motivations were dynastic ambition, territorial gain, and local power struggles. While religious fervor was undoubtedly a powerful motivator, particularly among the populace and the military orders, the political realities were far more complex. Kings of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre frequently fought each other, formed alliances with Muslim rulers against Christian rivals, and pursued their own interests with little regard for a unified Christian front. For example, during the 13th century, while Castile and Aragon were making significant advances against Al-Andalus, they also engaged in conflicts over border territories, demonstrating that their ambitions were not always aligned. This complex interplay of cooperation and competition paints a much more nuanced picture than a simple narrative of a monolithic Christian crusade. Perhaps these internal rivalries, ironically, contributed to the strength of each kingdom, forcing them to constantly innovate and consolidate their power to compete effectively. The 13th century marked a high point for the Reconquista, with the decisive Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 being a turning point. This battle, where a coalition of Castilian, Aragonese, Navarrese, and Portuguese forces decisively defeated the Almohad Caliphate, shattered Muslim military power in the peninsula, and opened the way for rapid Christian expansion. Following this victory, Fernando III of Castile, known as the Saint, captured Córdoba in 1236 and Seville in 1248, reclaiming two of the most important cities of Al-Andalus. Jaume I of Aragon, the conqueror, simultaneously expanded his realm, capturing the Balearic Islands and Valencia. By the end of the century, only the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada remained as the last vestige of Muslim rule in Iberia. A vibrant but increasingly isolated emirate clinging to the southern coast, the consolidation of these kingdoms also brought about significant changes in their internal structures. Royal power generally increased, though often in tension with the burgeoning power of the nobility and the growing influence of urban centres. The Cortes, or representative assemblies, in Castile, Aragon, and Portugal began to play a more significant role, providing a forum for dialogue between the monarch and the various estates of the realm, nobility, clergy, and town representatives. These assemblies were crucial for approving taxes, legislating, and sometimes even challenging royal authority. The development of these institutions laid the groundwork for the future political systems of Spain and Portugal. Economically, the kingdoms flourished, albeit in different ways. Castile, with its vast agricultural lands and its merino sheep, developed a strong wool industry, becoming a major exporter of raw wool to Flanders and England. The Mester, a powerful guild of sheep owners, played a significant role in Castilian economy and politics. Aragon, as noted, leveraged its maritime power, with Barcelona becoming a major Mediterranean trading hub, exchanging goods from across Europe and the Islamic world. Portugal, after securing its borders, began to look beyond the immediate pen. Insula, developing its fishing industry and early maritime trade routes, foreshadowing its future global explorations. Culturally, this period saw a fascinating blend of influences. The newly conquered territories, particularly in Castile and Aragon, were home to large populations of Muslims, Mudejars, and Jews, who continued to practice their religions and maintain their customs under Christian rule, albeit with varying degrees of tolerance and often under increasing pressure. These communities contributed immensely to the intellectual, artistic, and economic life of the Christian kingdoms. Toledo, after its conquest, became a major centre for translation, where scholars from across Europe came to study Arabic texts on philosophy, science, and medicine, translating them into Latin and thus transmitting vital knowledge to the West. This intellectual cross-pollination was a defining feature of medieval Iberia, a bridge between East and West. The architectural landscape also transformed. Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals began to rise across the Christian north, often built on the sites of former mosques, embodying the triumph of Christianity. Yet in some areas, particularly in the south, a unique Mudejar style emerged, where Muslim artisans, working under Christian patronage, incorporated Islamic decorative elements and building techniques into Christian structures, creating a beautiful fusion of styles. The Alcazar of Seville, for instance, a royal palace for Castilian kings, showcases exquisite Mudejar craftsmanship, a testament to the enduring presence and artistic skill of its Muslim inhabitants. As the 14th century dawned, these Christian kingdoms, each with its unique character and ambitions, stood poised for the next chapter of their history. The initial phase of consolidation and expansion was largely complete, and they now faced new challenges: internal dynastic struggles, the Black Death, and the growing complexities of governing diverse populations. The rivalry between Castile and Aragon, in particular, would intensify, shaping the political landscape for centuries to come. Navarre, often caught in the crosscurrents of larger powers, would continue its delicate dance of diplomacy, while Portugal, having secured its peninsular borders, began to cast its gaze towards the vast, unexplored expanse of the Atlantic. The stage was set for the final act of the Reconquista and the eventual unification of Spain. But that story was still unfolding, piece by painstaking piece, across the sun-drenched plains and rugged mountains of medieval Iberia. The whispers of ancient Visigothic kings and Roman emperors still echoed, but now they were joined by the clang of Castilian steel, the rustle of Aragonese sails, and the fervent prayers of Portuguese mariners, all contributing to the rich tapestry of a land forever shaped by its diverse heritage. As the Reconquista slowly, inexorably pushed southward, the tapestry of Iberian society grew even more intricate, weaving together threads of faith and culture in ways both harmonious and fraught. For centuries, the peninsula had been a land where three Abrahamic faiths, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, coexisted, sometimes peacefully, often uneasily. Now, as Christian kingdoms expanded their dominion, new social categories emerged, reflecting the shifting sands of power and identity. Among the most prominent were the Mudejars and the Mozarabs, whose lives offer a profound glimpse into the complexities of medieval Spain. The Mozarabs, meaning would-be Arabs or Arabized, were Iberian Christians who lived under Muslim rule. Their story begins much earlier, with the initial Umayyad conquest in the 8th century. For over 300 years, and in some regions even longer, these communities maintained their Christian faith and traditions within a predominantly Islamic society. They spoke Arabic, often adopted Arab customs and dress, and participated in the intellectual and economic life of Al-Andalus. Their churches, though sometimes restricted in their outward display, continued to function, and their bishops maintained contact with Christian communities further north. It was a remarkable testament to cultural resilience and adaptation. Life for the Mozarabs was a delicate balance. As people of the book, Christians and Jews were generally afforded dhimmi status under Islamic law, which granted them protection of life and property, freedom of worship, and the right to administer their own internal affairs, in exchange for paying a special tax called the jizya. This system, while often tolerant, was not without its limitations. Dhimmis were considered second-class citizens, subject to certain sumptuary laws, and generally excluded from positions of political power or religious authority. Yet many Mozarabs thrived, becoming skilled artisans, merchants, and even scholars, contributing to the vibrant intellectual life of cities like Toledo and Córdoba. They were often bilingual, fluent in both Arabic and Latin, and served as crucial intermediaries between the Islamic and Christian worlds, transmitting knowledge and culture. One of the most fascinating aspects of Mozarabic culture was its unique artistic and architectural style. Mozarabic art, particularly in illuminated manuscripts and church architecture, blended Visigothic traditions with Islamic influences. Think of the horseshoe arches in some early Christian churches in northern Spain, or the intricate geometric patterns found in Mozarabic Bibles. These were not mere imitations, but a genuine synthesis. A visual language born of a shared space. The Mozarabic rite, a distinct liturgical tradition that predated the Roman rite, also persisted, a powerful symbol of their enduring identity. Even after the Reconquista of Toledo in 1085, the Mozarabic rite continued to be celebrated in some churches, a living echo of a bygone era. However, the Mozarabic experience was not uniformly idyllic. There were periods of heightened tension and persecution, particularly during the more fundamentalist Almoravid and Almohad dynasties, who viewed the dhimmi system with less tolerance. In the 9th century, Córdoba witnessed the Martyrs of Córdoba, a group of Mozarab Christians who deliberately provoked martyrdom by publicly blaspheming Islam, a complex phenomenon that historians still debate whether it was an act of religious zealotry, a protest against perceived cultural assimilation, or a desperate cry for identity in a rapidly changing world. These events, while not representative of the entire Mozarabic experience, highlight the underlying pressures and the constant negotiation of identity. As Christian kingdoms advanced, the situation for Mozarabs became even more precarious. Those living in the southern territories often found themselves caught between two worlds. When a Christian city fell to the Reconquista, Mozarabs, as fellow Christians, were sometimes welcomed, but often viewed with suspicion due to their Arabized customs and language. Many migrated north, contributing to the repopulation of newly conquered lands. But their distinct cultural identity gradually faded, absorbed into the dominant Castilian or Aragonese cultures. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Mozarab identity as a distinct cultural group had largely disappeared, leaving behind a rich legacy in art, architecture, and language. The Mudejars, on the other hand, represent the inverse of the Mozarab experience. The term Mudejar derives from the Arabic word mudajan, meaning tamed or domesticated, and refers to Muslims who remained in Christian-conquered territories. Their story begins in earnest with the fall of Toledo in 1085 and intensified with the great wave of Reconquista victories in the 13th century. Particularly the fall of Córdoba in 1236 and Seville in 1248. These were vast Muslim populations suddenly finding themselves under Christian rule. For the Christian monarchs, the Mudejars presented both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, their presence represented a potential internal threat, a population whose loyalties might lie with their co-religionists in Granada or North Africa. On the other hand, they were an invaluable asset. Muslim farmers possessed superior irrigation techniques. Their artisans were renowned for their craftsmanship in ceramics, textiles, and construction, and their merchants were vital to the economy. Expelling them en masse was often impractical and undesirable. Thus, a system of capitulations and charters was developed, outlining the rights and obligations of Mudejar communities. These charters, known as fueros, often guaranteed them the right to practice their religion, use their own language, Arabic, maintain their own legal customs, Sharia law for internal disputes, and retain their property. In many ways, this mirrored the dhimmi system under Muslim rule, though with important differences. Mudejars, like Mozarabs, were often required to live in separate quarters, known as morerias, wear distinctive clothing, and were subject to specific taxes. They were generally excluded from holding public office and faced social discrimination. The Mudejar experience varied significantly depending on the region and the era. In some areas, particularly Aragon and Valencia, where large Mudejar populations remained after the conquest, their communities were relatively stable and prosperous for centuries. They continued their agricultural practices, contributing significantly to the economy, and their artistic traditions flourished. Mudejar architecture, a unique blend of Islamic and Gothic styles, is perhaps the most enduring legacy of this period. Think of the intricate brickwork, glazed tiles, and elaborate plasterwork found in churches and synagogues built by Mudejar craftsmen for Christian patrons. The churches of Teruel, with their stunning Mudejar towers, are a prime example, showcasing the exquisite artistry and technical skill of these Muslim builders working within a Christian context. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was often a practical one, as Mudejar artisans were the most skilled available. However, the tolerance afforded to Mudejars was always conditional and often fragile. As the Reconquista progressed and the fervor of religious identity intensified, pressure to convert grew. Initially, forced conversions were rare, as Christian law generally forbade them. But over time, particularly in the 15th century, the atmosphere shifted. The fall of Granada in 1492 marked a turning point. The initial capitulations signed by Boabdil, the last Nasrid Sultan, guaranteed the religious freedom of the Muslims of Granada. However, this promise was short-lived. Cardinal Cisneros, the powerful Archbishop of Toledo, initiated a policy of forced conversions in Granada in 1499. Is sparked the first rebellion of the Almohadas, a desperate but ultimately futile resistance by the newly converted Muslims, known as Moriscos. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and the policy of forced conversion was extended throughout Castile. In 1502, Queen Isabella issued an edict requiring all Muslims in Castile to convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom. Aragon and Valencia followed suit in 1526. This effectively ended the Mudejar period, transforming them into Moriscos, Muslims who had nominally converted to Christianity but often continued to practice Islam in secret. The lives of the Moriscos were even more fraught with tension and suspicion. They were constantly monitored by the Inquisition, forbidden from speaking Arabic, wearing traditional dress, or maintaining their customs. Their secret adherence to Islam, known as taqiyya, was a dangerous gamble, often punishable by severe penalties. The Second Rebellion of the Almohadas, 1568 to 1571, was a direct consequence of these oppressive policies, leading to the forced dispersion of Moriscos throughout Castile and further weakening their communities. The ultimate tragedy for the Moriscos came in 1609, when King Philip III, persuaded by fears of internal subversion and external alliances with the Ottoman Empire, decreed their expulsion from all Spanish kingdoms. Hundreds of thousands of Moriscos, many of whom were by then generations removed from the original conversions and spoke only Spanish, were forced to leave their homes, often losing all their possessions. This expulsion, a monumental act of ethnic cleansing, had devastating economic consequences for Spain, particularly for the agricultural regions of Valencia and Aragon, which relied heavily on Morisco labour and expertise. It also represented a profound loss of cultural diversity and a dark stain on Spain's history. The Mudejar and Morisco experience highlights a crucial historical debate. Was medieval Spain a model of convivencia, a peaceful coexistence of cultures and religions, or a land of constant tension and conflict? The truth, as often happens, lies somewhere in the middle. There were undoubtedly periods and places of remarkable tolerance and cultural exchange, where Christians, Muslims and Jews lived side by side, influencing each other's art, science, and philosophy. The Mozarabs and Mudejars are living proof of this intermingling, their very existence a testament to the porous boundaries between communities. Yet, underlying this coexistence was always a power dynamic, a hierarchy, and the ever-present threat of religious intolerance. The Dini system, while offering protection, was not one of equality. The forced conversions and eventual expulsions of the Mudejars and Moriscos demonstrate the ultimate fragility of this coexistence in the face of political and religious pressures. The narrative of medieval Spain is not a simple one of either perfect harmony or constant strife, but rather a complex interplay of both, a constant negotiation between difference and shared humanity. Perhaps these stories of Mudejars and Mozarabs, caught between shifting empires and evolving identities, whisper a timeless lesson about the human capacity for adaptation, resilience, and the enduring power of cultural heritage, even in the face of immense pressure. Their legacy, etched in the very stones of Spain's cathedrals and mosques, in the melodies of its music and the flavors of its cuisine, reminds us that history is rarely monochromatic, but a rich, often turbulent, blend of many hues. The slow, inexorable tide of the Reconquista, which had ebbed and flowed for centuries across the Iberian Peninsula, now gathered its final overwhelming momentum. With the Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon united under the formidable crowns of Ferdinand II and Isabella I, the stage was set for the final act, the conquest of Granada, the last bastion of Islamic rule in Western Europe. This wasn't merely a territorial dispute, it was a crusade. A culmination of centuries of religious fervour, political ambition, and cultural clash. By the mid-15th century, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, though still a jewel of art and learning, found itself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Its once expansive borders had shrunk dramatically, hemmed in by the ever-encroaching Christian territories. The kingdom, a vibrant tapestry of Arab, Berber, and indigenous Iberian cultures, was a testament to a golden age. Yet its internal divisions and the sheer numerical superiority of its adversaries made its long-term survival precarious. The Nasrid sultans, for all their diplomatic skill and military proficiency, were caught in a tightening vice. Ferdinand and Isabella, known to history as the Catholic monarchs, embodied a new kind of unified power in Spain. Their marriage in 1469 had not just joined two powerful houses, but had laid the foundation for a unified Spanish state. Their vision was grand, a Spain united under a single faith and a single crown. The existence of an independent Muslim kingdom, however cultivated and sophisticated, within their burgeoning realm, was an anomaly they were determined to rectify. The war for Granada was not a swift, decisive campaign, but a protracted, often brutal struggle that spanned a decade, from 1482 to 1492. It was a war of sieges, skirmishes, and psychological attrition. Fought across the rugged terrain of Andalusia, the Christian forces, now well organized and equipped, systematically chipped away at Nasrid defenses, capturing one town and fortress after another. Each victory, however small, fueled the Christian resolve and further isolated Granada. One of the lesser-known aspects of this final push was the innovative use of artillery by the Christian forces. While gunpowder weapons had been present in earlier conflicts, Ferdinand and Isabella's army deployed them with unprecedented effectiveness. Massive cannons, painstakingly transported across difficult landscapes, were used to breach walls that had once seemed impregnable. This technological advantage, combined with superior logistics and a swimmingly endless supply of manpower, began to tip the scales decisively. The Nasrid sultans, particularly Abu Abdallah Muhammad XII, known to the Castilians as Boabdil, faced an impossible dilemma. He inherited a kingdom on the brink, plagued by internal feuds, often pitting members of his own family against each other for control. This internecine strife, a tragic echo of earlier Taifa kingdoms, fatally weakened Granada at its most critical hour. Boabdil himself was a complex figure, at times courageous, at others seemingly indecisive, caught between the demands of his people, the pressures of his family, and the overwhelming power of the Catholic monarchs. Historians still debate the extent to which Boabdil's personal failings contributed to the fall of Granada versus the sheer inevitability of the Christian advance. Was he a tragic hero, a victim of circumstance, or did his internal conflicts hasten his kingdom's demise? The truth likely lies in a nuanced blend of all these factors. The siege of Granada itself, which began in the spring of 1491, was a monumental undertaking. Ferdinand and Isabella established a vast military encampment, Santa Fe, just outside the city walls. This temporary city, built in a matter of months, was a powerful symbol of Christian determination. It had its own streets, churches, and even a hospital, signaling that the besiegers were prepared for a long stay, a stark contrast to the more fleeting encampments of earlier medieval warfare. The sight of Santa Fe, a permanent Christian presence on their very doorstep, must have been a chilling one for the Grenadines. Inside the Alhambra, the magnificent palace complex that crowned Granada, the mood was one of despair, mixed with defiant hope. The city's inhabitants, a diverse mix of Muslims, Jews, and even some Christians, faced starvation and constant bombardment. Yet, the spirit of resistance flickered. The Alhambra itself, with its intricate defences and strategic position, was a formidable stronghold. Its walls, adorned with exquisite calligraphy and geometric patterns, had witnessed centuries of history, and now they stood as the last bulwark against an encroaching world. As the siege wore on, the conditions within Granada became increasingly dire. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread, and the constant threat of attack wore down the population. Boabdil, facing mounting pressure from his people and his advisors, began secret negotiations with the Catholic monarchs. The terms were harsh, but offered a semblance of dignity and religious freedom for the remaining Muslim population. The capitulation agreement, signed in November 1491, guaranteed the Granadans the right to practice their religion, retain their property, and be judged by their own laws. These promises, however, would prove fragile in the years to come. On January 2nd, 1492, a date forever etched in Spanish history, the keys to Granada were formally handed over to Ferdinand and Isabella. The Christian banner, emblazoned with the cross, was unfurled atop the Torre de la Vela, the highest tower of the Alhambra. Legend has it that Boabdil, as he departed his beloved city, paused on a hill overlooking Granada and wept, a moment forever immortalized as the last sigh of the Moor. His mother is said to have rebuked him, saying, "You do well to weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." While likely apocryphal, this story captures the profound sense of loss and the end of an era. The fall of Granada marked the symbolic end of the Reconquista, a process that had spanned nearly 8 centuries. It was not just a military victory, but a profound cultural and religious shift that reshaped the identity of Spain. For the Catholic monarchs, it was the culmination of their vision, solidifying their power and paving the way for a unified imperial Spain. For the Granadans, it was the end of a civilization, a vibrant society that had enriched the peninsula with its art, science, and philosophy. The immediate aftermath of the conquest was complex. Initially, the terms of the capitulation were largely respected. Muslims were allowed to continue practicing their faith, and many chose to remain in Granada. However, this period of relative tolerance was short-lived. The fervent religious atmosphere of the time, coupled with political pressures, soon led to a more aggressive policy of conversion. Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, a key figure in the Spanish Inquisition, began a campaign of forced conversions and the destruction of Arabic manuscripts, aiming to eliminate Islamic culture from Spain. This policy ignited a series of revolts among the Mudejars, Muslims living under Christian rule, and later the Moriscos, converted Muslims. The most significant of these was the Alpujarras Rebellion, 1568 to 1571, a desperate uprising against increasing oppression and the prohibition of Islamic customs. These revolts were brutally suppressed, leading to mass expulsions and further erosion of the Muslim presence in Spain. By the early 17th century, the final expulsion of the Moriscos would effectively erase overt Islamic presence from the peninsula, though their cultural legacy would remain deeply embedded. The fall of Granada also had far-reaching consequences beyond the Iberian Peninsula. It freed up resources and attention for other ventures, most notably the voyages of Christopher Columb, who secured the patronage of Ferdinand and Isabella in that same momentous year of 1492. The wealth and unified power forged during the Reconquista would fuel Spain's rise as a global empire, forever altering the course of world history. Yet the legacy of Al-Andalus, the Islamic Spain that had flourished for so long, endured. The architectural marvels of the Alhambra, the Giralda of Seville, and the Mezquita of Córdoba stand as enduring testaments to a sophisticated civilization. The Arabic language, though suppressed, left an indelible mark on Spanish vocabulary, particularly in place names and agricultural terms. The intellectual contributions in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, though often overlooked in the immediate aftermath of the Reconquista, continued to influence European thought, often through translation and transmission via scholars. The end of the Reconquista was not a clean break, but a complex, often painful transition. It was a period of both profound loss and the birth of a new identity. The unified Spain that emerged from these centuries of conflict was a powerful entity, but it was also a society shaped by the tensions and contradictions of its own making. The echoes of the past, of Moorish Spain and Christian Spain, continued to resonate in the cultural landscape, shaping the very soul of the nation. The winds that swept through the now silent halls of the Alhambra might have carried whispers of forgotten poets, of scholars debating under starlit skies, and of the vibrant life that once thrived within its walls, a testament to the enduring power of human endeavour and the bittersweet nature of history's turning tides. As the dust of centuries settled over the Iberian Peninsula, a new tapestry began to weave itself, rich and intricate, unlike any other in medieval Europe. This was a land where the echoes of ancient Rome still lingered in crumbling aqueducts and the very foundations of cities, but where the vibrant hues of Islamic civilization now painted the landscape alongside the more muted tones of Christian kingdoms. It was a crucible of cultures, a place where languages intertwined like the threads of a finely spun garment, and where the clash and confluence of ideas forged a society of unparalleled complexity and dynamism. Imagine a bustling marketplace in Córdoba in the 10th century, a sensory explosion of sights, sounds, and smells. The air would be thick with the aroma of exotic spices, cumin, coriander, saffron, wafting from merchant stalls, mingling with the sweet scent of figs and dates, and the earthy smell of freshly baked bread. The chatter of voices would be a symphony of Arabic, Latin, Mozarabic, a Romance dialect spoken by Christians under Muslim rule, and even Hebrew, as traders from across the Mediterranean and beyond haggled over silks from China, intricate metalwork from Damascus, and precious jewels from India. Scholars, identifiable by their finely bound manuscripts, might pause to discuss a passage from Aristotle or a new astronomical observation, their debates sometimes spilling into the open air, drawing curious onlookers. This was the heart of Al-Andalus, a jewel of the Islamic world, where intellectual curiosity was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. The artistic achievements of this period were nothing short of breathtaking. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, with its mesmerizing forest of striped arches, stands as a testament to the architectural genius of the Umayyad Caliphate. Its intricate geometric patterns, delicate calligraphy, and the interplay of light and shadow within its vast prayer hall created an atmosphere of profound serenity and awe. This wasn't merely a place of worship, it was a symbol of power, learning, and cultural sophistication. Further north, in the nascent Christian kingdoms, Romanesque churches began to rise, their sturdy stone walls and rounded arches reflecting a different aesthetic, one rooted in a more austere, yet equally profound, spirituality. The frescoes within these churches, though often faded now, would have once glowed with vibrant colours, depicting biblical scenes for a largely illiterate populace, serving as both instruction and inspiration. Economically, the Iberian Peninsula was a powerhouse. Al-Andalus, in particular, flourished due to its advanced agricultural techniques. The Moors introduced sophisticated irrigation systems, drawing water from rivers and wells to transform arid lands into fertile gardens. They cultivated crops previously unknown in Europe, such as rice, sugarcane, oranges, and lemons, which not only enriched their own diet, but also became valuable trade commodities. The port cities like Seville and Valencia hummed with activity, their docks laden with goods destined for distant lands. Christian kingdoms, while initially less developed, gradually adopted some of these innovations, particularly in agriculture and craftsmanship, as trade routes opened and cultural exchange occurred, sometimes peacefully, sometimes through conquest. The wool industry, for instance, became a cornerstone of the Castilian economy, with vast flocks of sheep grazing across the Meseta, their fleeces supplying weavers throughout Europe. Daily life, however, varied dramatically depending on one's religion, social standing, and geographical location. In Al-Andalus, urban life was often characterized by public baths, libraries, and lively taverns where poetry was recited and music played. Women, while generally confined to the domestic sphere, enjoyed certain legal protections under Islamic law and were often educated, particularly in wealthy families. Scholars like Ibn Hazm, a prominent 11th century polymath from Córdoba, wrote extensively on love, ethics, and theology, offering a glimpse into the intellectual and social currents of the time. His work, The Ring of the Dove, is a poignant exploration of love in all its forms, reflecting a sophisticated and introspective society. In the Christian kingdoms, life was often more rural and agrarian, centered around the village and the parish church. Feudal structures dictated much of society, with peasants working the land in exchange for protection from their lords. Daily routines were governed by the rhythms of the agricultural year and the liturgical calendar. Pilgrimages, particularly to Santiago de Compostela, were a central feature of religious life, drawing pilgrims from across Europe and fostering a sense of shared Christian identity. These arduous journeys were not just acts of devotion, but also important avenues for cultural exchange, bringing new ideas, goods, and stories into the remote corners of the peninsula. The linguistic landscape was equally fascinating. While Arabic became the dominant language of administration and high culture in Al-Andalus, Latin persisted as the language of the church and scholarship in Christian territories. However, the everyday speech of the common people was a vibrant mix of evolving Romance dialects, which would eventually give rise to modern Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan. Mozarabic, a Romance dialect heavily influenced by Arabic, was spoken by Christians living under Muslim rule, a testament to the deep linguistic intermingling. The very word Mozarab comes from the Arabic mustab, meaning Arabized. This linguistic fusion is still evident today in the thousands of Spanish words derived from Arabic, such as azúcar, sugar, almohada, pillow, and naranja, orange. However, this idyllic picture of coexistence often glosses over the underlying tensions and conflicts. While periods of relative peace and intellectual exchange certainly existed, particularly during the early centuries of Al-Andalus, the Reconquista, the centuries-long process by which Christian kingdoms expanded southwards, was a defining feature of the medieval Iberian experience. This was not a continuous, unified campaign, but rather a series of intermittent wars, skirmishes, and political maneuvering, punctuated by periods of truce and even alliance between Christian and Muslim rulers against common enemies. The concept of convivencia, or coexistence, is a scholarly dispute that continues to be debated among historians. Some argue that it truly represents a golden age of interfaith harmony and intellectual collaboration, while others contend that it was more a pragmatic arrangement, often fraught with discrimination and violence, particularly against Jews and Christians living in Muslim lands, and vice versa. For example, while Jewish communities undeniably thrived in Al-Andalus, producing brilliant scholars, poets, and philosophers like Maimonides and Judah Halevi, they were still considered dhimmis, protected peoples, but subject to certain restrictions and taxes not imposed on Muslims. Similarly, in Christian kingdoms, Jewish and Muslim communities faced varying degrees of tolerance and persecution, often depending on the whims of the local ruler or the prevailing political climate. The massacres of Jews in Granada in 1066, for instance, serve as a stark reminder that even in periods of relative prosperity, underlying prejudices could erupt into horrific violence. One lesser-known detail that highlights the cultural exchange is the significant impact of Islamic science and philosophy on Christian Europe, often transmitted through the very scholars who lived in Al-Andalus. Toledo, after its conquest by Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085, became a crucial center for translation. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, translating Arabic texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy into Latin. These translations reintroduced classical Greek thought, preserved and elaborated upon by Islamic scholars, to Western Europe, sparking the intellectual revival of the 12th century. Imagine the quiet intensity in those scriptoria, the scratching of quills, the murmur of different languages, as ancient wisdom was painstakingly rendered into new forms, bridging centuries and civilizations. This intellectual current flowed northward, profoundly influencing the nascent universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. The legal systems also reflected the diverse nature of Iberian society. In Al-Andalus, Islamic law, Sharia, governed most aspects of life, though local customs and traditions often played a role. For non-Muslims, their own religious laws were generally respected in matters of personal status, such as marriage and inheritance. In Christian kingdoms, Roman law, Germanic traditions, and local customs all contributed to a complex patchwork of legal codes. The fueros, charters granted by monarchs to towns and communities, often detailed specific rights and obligations, reflecting a degree of local autonomy and legal variation. The military landscape was equally complex. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal gradually consolidated their power, often through strategic marriages and alliances, but also through fierce battles against the various Taifa kingdoms that emerged after the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate in the early 11th century. The figure of El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, a Castilian knight who famously fought for both Christian and Muslim rulers in the late 11th century, embodies the fluid and often opportunistic nature of warfare during this period. His story, immortalized in the Cantar de Mio Cid, reveals a world where loyalty could be a complex affair and where military prowess was valued above all else. As the centuries progressed, the balance of power slowly shifted. The Almoravids and Almohads, successive Berber dynasties from North Africa, briefly re-established a unified Islamic rule over Al-Andalus, bringing with them a more austere interpretation of Islam and a renewed military vigor. Their architectural legacy, though less ornate than the Umayyad period, is still visible in structures like the Giralda in Seville, originally the minaret of a mosque. However, internal divisions and the relentless pressure from the Christian kingdoms eventually led to their decline. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 was a pivotal moment, a decisive victory for the combined Christian forces against the Almohads, marking a significant turning point in the Reconquista. From then on, the tide increasingly turned in favor of the Christian kingdoms. By the mid-13th century, only the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada remained as the last bastion of Muslim rule on the peninsula, a vibrant and sophisticated state that would endure for another 2.5 centuries. The Alhambra, the magnificent palace and fortress complex in Granada, stands as the crowning achievement of Nasrid architecture. Its delicate stucco work, serene courtyards, and shimmering tile mosaics create an ethereal beauty that seems to defy the passage of time. The Court of the Lions, with its intricate fountain and slender columns, whispers tales of sultans and poets, of quiet contemplation and courtly intrigue. It's a place where water, light, and architecture combine to create a sense of paradise on earth, a poignant reminder of a civilization on the cusp of its twilight. Even as the political boundaries shifted, the cultural exchange continued, albeit with different dynamics. Mudejar art, a unique architectural style developed by Muslim craftsmen working in Christian territories, beautifully blends Islamic and Gothic elements. Churches and synagogues built in this style often feature intricate brickwork, horseshoe arches, and geometric patterns, demonstrating the enduring influence of Islamic aesthetics even after the conquest. This artistic fusion is a powerful symbol of the deep cultural roots that had taken hold over centuries, showing that even in times of conflict, beauty could transcend division. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, followed by the forced conversion or expulsion of the remaining Muslims in the early 17th century, marked a tragic end to this long and complex chapter of Iberian history. These events, driven by a desire for religious uniformity and national unity, shattered the intricate mosaic of cultures that had defined the peninsula for centuries. Imagine the heartbreak of families forced to abandon their ancestral homes, their livelihoods, and their very identities, carrying with them only memories and the echoes of a vibrant past. Yet the legacy of medieval Iberian society endures. It lives on in the architectural marvels that still grace the landscape, in the thousands of Arabic words woven into the Spanish language, in the musical traditions that blend Moorish melodies with Christian hymns, and in the intellectual currents that once flowed from Toledo across Europe. It reminds us that history is rarely simple, rarely black and white, but rather a complex interplay of forces, where conflict and collaboration, persecution and prosperity often exist side by side. The story of medieval Iberia is a testament to the enduring power of human creativity, resilience, and the profound, often unexpected ways in which different cultures can shape and enrich one another, even across vast divides. It is a story that continues to resonate, whispering its lessons to us across the centuries, if only we listen closely enough. As the 15th century began to stretch its long shadows across the Iberian Peninsula, a new chapter was being written, not in the clash of swords alone, but in the intricate dance of diplomacy, inheritance, and strategic alliances. The Christian kingdoms, though often embroiled in their own internal squabbles and dynastic rivalries, were slowly, inexorably coalescing. The crowns of Castile and Aragon, the two most powerful entities, represented the culmination of centuries of Reconquista efforts, each with its own distinct culture, language, and legal traditions. Castile, with its vast plains and burgeoning sheep farming, looked westward and southward, while Aragon, a maritime power, cast its gaze across the Mediterranean. The stage was set for a union that would reshape the very fabric of Iberia. In 1469, a marriage of immense political significance took place, one that would echo through the centuries. Isabella, half-sister to King Henry IV of Castile, and Ferdinand, heir apparent to the crown of Aragon, secretly wed in Valladolid. It was a union born of ambition and political necessity, defying the wishes of Henry IV, who had other plans for his sister's hand. Isabella, a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering resolve, understood the power that such an alliance could forge. Ferdinand, shrewd and pragmatic, recognized the opportunity to consolidate power and expand Aragon's influence. Their marriage, though initially met with resistance and even a brief civil war in Castile, ultimately paved the way for a united Spain. When Isabella ascended to the Castilian throne in 1474 and Ferdinand inherited the Aragonese crown in 1479, their personal union of crowns created a formidable new entity. It was not, however, a complete political merger. Castile and Aragon maintained their separate laws, institutions, and currencies, a testament to their distinct historical trajectories. Yet they acted in concert, their combined strength far greater than the sum of their individual parts. This union of the Catholic monarchs, as they would come to be known, set its sights on the last remaining bastion of Muslim rule in Iberia, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. For centuries, Granada had thrived, a jewel of Islamic civilization, a place where poetry and architecture flourished amidst the rugged mountains. The Alhambra, its iconic palace complex, stood as a testament to the sophistication and artistry of its rulers. Yet its existence was increasingly precarious, a small island in a sea of Christian kingdoms. Its strategic location, its fertile lands, and its symbolic importance made it an irresistible target for the newly unified Christian power. The war for Granada was not a swift campaign, but a decade-long struggle beginning in 1482. It was a conflict marked by sieges, skirmishes, and a relentless chipping away at the Nasrid defences. The Catholic monarchs brought to bear the full weight of their combined resources, employing new military technologies such as improved artillery and a disciplined, well-funded army. The war was also a psychological one. The Christian forces systematically isolated Granada, cutting off its supply lines and gradually conquering its surrounding territories. One lesser-known detail of this period is the role of the Santa Hermandad, a Castilian municipal police force which was reformed and used by Isabella to maintain order and raise funds for the war effort. This organization, often seen as a precursor to modern policing, played a crucial role in stabilizing the Christian territories and ensuring a steady flow of resources to the front lines. The siege of Granada itself was a monumental undertaking. For months, the Christian army encamped outside the city walls, building a temporary city of their own, Santa Fe, as a symbol of their unwavering commitment. Inside the city, Sultan Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler, faced a populace weary of war and increasingly divided. Historians still debate the extent to which internal dissension and factionalism within Granada contributed to its downfall, with some arguing that it was a primary factor, while others emphasize the overwhelming military superiority of the Christian forces. Perhaps the whispers of dissent within the Alhambra's ornate halls were as corrosive as the siege engines outside. On January 2nd, 1492, after a protracted siege, Granada finally surrendered. Boabdil, in a poignant and often romanticized moment, handed over the keys to the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. As he departed, legend has it that he looked back at the Alhambra one last time, shedding tears for his lost kingdom, a spot forever after known as the last sigh of the Moor. The fall of Granada was a momentous event, marking the definitive end of Muslim rule in Spain, which had endured for nearly 8 centuries. It was a victory celebrated throughout Christendom, a symbol of the triumph of the cross over the crescent. However, the year 1492 held another, darker chapter for Spain. Just a few months after the conquest of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from their kingdoms. This decree, a culmination of centuries of anti-Jewish sentiment and increasing pressure from religious authorities, forced tens of thousands of Jews to choose between conversion to Christianity or exile. Many chose exile, often leaving behind their homes, businesses, and a rich cultural heritage that had been woven into the fabric of Spain for over a millennium. The expulsion of the Jews, followed a decade later by the forced conversion or expulsion of the remaining Muslims, Moriscos, marked a profound shift in Spanish society, leading to a more religiously homogeneous, but arguably less diverse and vibrant nation. The year 1492 also witnessed another event of unparalleled significance, one that would forever alter the course of global history: Christopher Columbus's first voyage across the Atlantic. Funded by Isabella, who saw in Columbus's audacious plan a potential new route to the east and a way to spread Christianity, his journey to the New World opened up an entirely new era of exploration, conquest, and colonization. The riches that flowed back from the Americas, particularly gold and silver, would fuel Spain's rise to become the dominant European power for the next century. The unification of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella, sealed by the conquest of Granada and the subsequent policies of religious uniformity, marked a definitive end to the medieval period in Iberia. The fragmented kingdoms, the centuries of religious and cultural coexistence, however uneasy, gave way to a powerful, centralized monarchy with a singular religious identity. This new Spain, forged in the fires of the Reconquista and brimming with newfound wealth and ambition, was poised to cast its influence far beyond its borders. The medieval tapestry, with its intricate patterns of Moorish gardens and Christian castles, of Jewish scholars and Visigothic kings, was being carefully folded away, replaced by the bold, expansive canvas of a global empire. The echoes of 1,000 years of Iberian history, of Roman roads and Islamic calligraphy, of Christian hymns and Sephardic laments, would continue to resonate, but the dawn of a new age, an age of exploration and empire, had truly arrived. The unified Spanish monarchy, with its newfound power and resources, stood on the precipice of a future that few could have imagined.